In a world where droughts, floods, and disaster events have become commonplace, climate change is now impossible to ignore. Children are more vulnerable to these environmental shocks than adults for several reasons, including physical and psychological vulnerability. Many children live in areas that experience multiple, overlapping climate and environmental hazards. For this reason, organizations like African Child Policy Forum are critical in researching and monitoring these issues and creating dialogue via platforms such as the International Policy Conference on the African Child. Through combined efforts, we can influence pro-child policy and promote a common voice for the continent's children. Africa as a continent is responsible for less than 7% of global emissions, and its emissions per capita are less than half the global average. However, Africa's children bear the brunt of these effects. Sub-Saharan Africa has 35 of the 45 countries globally at highest climate risk, and there are 490 million children living in these countries under the age of 18. This imbalance in cause and effect is the paradox that stands in the way of meaningful change happening on the continent to address emissions. The continent is the lowest contributor to climate change, yet it is the principal victim. Children constitute about 50% of Africa's population, and they will need to make their way in a world that will become far more dangerous and uncertain in the years to come. The worst economic effects will be felt when children today reach their expected peak earnings by 2045, with up to an 80% decline in income growth compared to today. The Children's Climate Risk Index is a conceptual model that brings together the variables of a child's exposure to climate and environmental shocks and the vulnerabilities that the child may experience to give an index ranking. The countries that are the worst affected by climate change, according to the Children's Climate Risk Index, are also the countries with the highest under-5 mortality rate. The Central African Republic, Nigeria, and Chad, which occupy the first 3 positions in the index, rank 5th, 2nd, and 3rd respectively in global under-5 mortality. Child survival threats like malaria, diarrhea, and undernutrition have worsened. Overall, the death rate from climate change is between 60% and 80% higher in Africa than Southeast Asia, the next most vulnerable region. Girls are particularly vulnerable given the existing gender inequalities in access to water, sanitation, and hygiene that are exacerbated by climate change and environmental hazards. Natural disasters such as droughts, floods, and storms kill more women than men and tend to kill women at a younger age. The effect that climate change has already had on Africa's inhabitants is clearly measurable. The GDP per capita is almost 14% lower than it would be if anthropogenic warming had not occurred between 1991 and 2010. This economic damage may be 10% higher than the next most affected region, Asia, particularly India, and more than twice as high as in the US, Eurasia, and Latin America. Extrapolating forwards, in just under 8 years from today, almost 40 million additional people in sub-Saharan Africa could be pushed into extreme poverty due to climate change, more than in any other world region. This is a burden that cannot be taken lightly. In Niger, Somalia, and Guinea-Bissau, the world's 3 most climate-vulnerable countries, poverty rates already stand at 77%, 89%, and 85% respectively. One of the most direct effects of climate change is on food production. By 2030, it will lead to an increase in the price of maize by 65% in East Africa, 89% in West Africa, and a staggering 129% in Southern Africa. A persistent 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature will cause the loss of 65% of current maize growth capacity and an estimated 20% drop in world food production. A 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature will increase the prevalence of stunting by 7.4%, reversing the progress made on improving nutrition over the past decades. Water scarcity has led to increased livestock death with a devastating impact on families for whom livestock are the main source of income and nutrition. In the next 2 decades, Between 37 and 125 million additional African children will be subjected to water scarcity. By 2050, in sub-Saharan Africa, people will on average have less than 2,000 calories a day, compared with over 2,300 in 2000, negatively affecting physical and intellectual development. An estimated 25 million children will be undernourished due to climate change. When climate change creates conditions of increased stress on family units, children are often the first to feel the impact. The sudden drop in household income due to a severe climate event has led to child labor as a risk management strategy. In the regions of Ethiopia worst affected by the recent drought, child marriage has on average more than doubled in the space of 1 year. In one region alone, FGM has increased by 27%. In Malawi, out of the 4 to 5 million girls at risk of getting married, around 1.5 million of them are pushed into marriage because of climate change-related events. Across the continent, climate-induced displacement leaves children at a much higher risk of abduction, abuse, trafficking, and recruitment into armed groups. Children are disproportionately impacted by conflict, and climate change is recognized as a threat multiplier due to its role in exacerbating the usual causes of conflict. For example, changes in climate increase the competition for scarce resources, such as water or grazing land. Many of the factors that increase the risk of civil war are sensitive to climate change. Ongoing conflict also tends to diminish the capacities required to adapt to climate change. Of the 10 most climate-vulnerable countries, the DRC, Mali, Somalia, and Sudan have also seen some of Africa's most violent events between 2010 and 2022. Environmental threats due to climate change force 37.5 million children to have their education interrupted every year. The number of children at risk of dropping out of school in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia due to the impact of the drought tripled in the space of 3 months in 2022, from 1.1 million to an estimated 3.3 million children. Water scarcity and long hours spent by children to fetch water has negatively affected children's schooling, and a child who experiences temperatures above average is predicted to attain 1.5 fewer years of schooling than one who experiences average temperatures. Across Africa, displacement due to climate-related disaster events is a significant issue. Between 2008 and 2019, they caused the displacement of 23 million people. In the first half of 2020 alone, almost 10 million people were displaced in the Horn of Africa. This number of internal climate migrants is only expected to worsen. By 2050, 86 million people will be displaced in sub-Saharan Africa due to climate change. Climate change discussions in Africa and globally are ongoing, and yet in most cases, governments are not involving children in these deliberations. Only 13 countries in Africa have developed and published their national adaptation plans, and very few of these plans mention children. Only 3 African countries funded measures to address climate risks within their investment priorities. Africa's adaptation cost is higher than in any other region in the world, at up to 1.4% of GDP. In 2010, in Copenhagen, wealthy nations made a pledge to commit $100 billion a year to less wealthy nations by 2020 to assist with climate change adaptation and mitigation. However, the amounts mobilized per year since then have ranged between $58 billion and $80 billion. This is just a fraction of the $1.3 trillion per year by 2030 that African negotiators called for at COP26 in Glasgow. The financial gap between what is available and what is needed in Africa for meaningful adaptation currently stands at 80%. Today's children are not only paying a heavy price due to the climate crisis now, but they are likely to continue suffering from it well into the future. Climate change is, therefore, both a present danger of considerable gravity and complexity, as well as a lifelong tragedy facing Africa's children. Therefore, concerted, multi-layered action needs to be taken to, amongst others, create climate awareness among children and the public, including in school curricula. Develop national climate adaptation and mitigation plans that fully take children's needs into account. And to ensure greater climate justice, including in climate financing by the wealthy, in order to address the needs of the poorest majority who are suffering the consequences the most.